Hey there, Gothamites. Brian Ward here, welcoming you to another very special episode of the Arkham Sessions. This one is throwing it all the way back to July of this year when we recorded our panel on the psychology of Star Trek Picard Season 3 at San Diego Comic-Con. Joining us for that panel were very special guests Christopher Monfette and Matt Okumura, both of whom are writers and producers on the show, and they were aces, I've got to tell you. Originally, we were supposed to have showrunner Terry Matalas and star Todd Stashwick join us. Unfortunately, the moment the actors went on strike, Todd and I agreed that he should sit this one out, even though we would have loved to have had him. And then on the day, Terry was unable to join us. It had nothing to do with the writer's strike, but we totally understood. And luckily, we had Chris and Matt there to pick up where the others couldn't join us. So they were fantastic. Without a doubt, made this panel something that we'll remember for a long time, and we hope you enjoy it. I want to give a very quick shout out to Garrard Whatley, who helped me with this audio. At the time, when we recorded it, I had hooked up a Tascam recorder to the mixing board, and unfortunately, the person who was operating the Tascam and the mixer there in the room did not hit record properly. So the good audio we should have pulled right off the board, unfortunately, is not what you're going to be hearing. Instead, I always like to have backups. And in this case, Drea and I were both wearing wireless lav microphones from DJI. And that's why you're going to hear us sounding a bit better and louder and more clear than our guests. But with the help of Garrett, he really did an amazing job of trying to balance the audio for us. And he worked magic that I never would have been able to. So for as unfortunate as this audio is, just imagine what it could have sounded like if we had not had Garrett's help. He really is a wizard, and I appreciate all of his help with this audio. So with that being said, once again, welcome, and we hope you enjoy the psychology of Star Trek Picard Season 3.
Hello, Comic-Con 2023! Thank you all for coming. I swear this is going to be such a fun panel. There might be a little confusion as you came in. If you looked at the book at one point, there were names that you won't see here. If you looked at the website, there may be names that you might not see here. It's not going to stop us from having this panel. My name is Brian Ward. I am the co-host of a podcast called The Arkham Sessions.
Thank you.
For those of you who don't know who we are, we analyze pop culture through a very critical lens of a clinical psychologist. With me, we started out doing Batman the Animated Series. We did the entire run of that. We have since gone on to like Doom Patrol, Steven Universe. We've tackled Star Wars, and now we're in the middle of Star Trek. So this is perfect timing for this panel. Joining me, as always, is that clinical psychologist. She works her day job at UCLA. She is also a consultant for writers of film, television, novels, comic books, you name it. If you're a writer and you want some tidbits on how to make things psychological, she's your person. She's even been written into DC Comics canon as a therapist to Batgirl during Gail Simone's run. So please welcome Dr. Drea Letterman.
Thank you. How are y'all feeling? Feel good? Are you rested?
Was that a psychology?
It is. Are you rested? Are you hydrated? Are you taken care of? No, it's Saturday night. We're tore up. Like, it's been a long but fun weekend.
But we're here to talk about psychology and Star Trek, so we know how to party on a Saturday night, right? I'm sorry? Oh, 100%. I definitely want people to be able to hear me. I don't really care about any hear that.
Can I do something? Can I do something a little disruptive? Can we move one over? Because I'm noticing that there are folks here that maybe can't see all of us.
Yes, of course.
Sorry.
Always looking out for them.
Thank you.
Looking out for your fellow humans. We're here to celebrate what I think, let's see if you think, is probably the best Trek that we have seen in decades by talking about Star Trek Picard Season 3. Who agrees with me here? Talk about a landing that a lot of us didn't know could be stuck. We did not expect what we got, and we have these two gentlemen to thank for it. Joining us, we have the co-executive producer and writer, Christopher Monfette, and co-producer and writer, Matt Okumura. Unfortunately, there is a little bit of an elephant in the room. There are a couple of important strikes going on right now with the WGA and SAG-AFTRA. We want to just go ahead and say that those of us on this panel, and I hope all of you, absolutely support our colleagues and our family and our friends so that they can make not just their own futures better, but the futures of those who want to come up in those paths and those fields as well. And unfortunately, as a result of the SAG-AFTRA strike, we had to say goodbye to our good friend Todd Stashwick, who is known as Captain Liam Shaw. And then just earlier, we received an email from Terry. He had to leave San Diego at 1 o'clock today to be in town for a very important meeting. I can't say what that is, I do not know, but I only hope that it means amazing things for all of us. By the way, that's not a hint. I literally don't know anything. If he says he's going to go to a meeting, I hope that's a good thing because I like Terry's writing. So I do want to get started on this panel, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. For starters, just going down the line, just going down the line very quickly, Trek, I want to ask, it's very clear to me that the writers' room were all fans of this franchise. I want to ask, starting with Chris, what was your first exposure to Trek? What made you realize these were characters that you absolutely wanted to write for?
The sort of shortish, longest answer to that question kind of really does, I think, dive into the roots of what we're talking about today, which is that I was very young. My mother had a period where she was going through a lot of medical issues, and sort of as a young kid who didn't really understand how to process the fear and uncertainty of that, my father, who was a very wonderful, beautiful man, but also very blue collar, the only way I think he really knew how to connect to and soothe and help his sort of geek son was with the sci-fi that he knew from his era. And so he introduced me at a young age to the original series, and we watched that together and really formed this bond between ourselves, and it really did help me to process and go through that period where my mother was struggling, and then that really did carry over into and time out sort of perfectly with Next Gen, which I then just sort of followed directly into. And I think at a certain point you see the commonality between those characters of brave, curious, exploratory souls who are pushing forward despite their flaws, despite their fears. And if they can be brave enough to do that, then certainly we can. So that was my sort of how I plugged in and sort of just what propelled me forward through my adolescence and all the iterations of the show that followed.
That's fantastic. Matt, sir, how about you?
It happened in stages, to be honest. I remember my family was looking for something to watch, and then we stumbled upon Next Gen. And my folks actually weren't Trekkies. They were more kind of like, Santa was fire type. Like frat pack or like drama. And
doesn't make you a bad person.
Not at all. But I was bored. And so when I watched Next Gen, I was like, what is this? I don't know what this is. And then in Hawaii, where I grew up, they would rerun the original series at like 10 o'clock, and they'd do like a 2-hour clock. And I'd stay out, I'd sit downstairs and I'd watch the episodes. And right around the same time, a friend of mine took me to see Star Trek 6. And you know, when you hear "Cry Havoc" and "Let's Let the Dogs of War," and you're this sort of like kid going, "What? I'm sorry, what is this?" And from that point on,
Shakespeare in the original Klingon.
Exactly. And if you haven't heard any original dialogue, but I went to my first convention at 12 years old, I want to say. I bought a Forrest Kelly autograph that I still have to this day, and it's on stage somewhere because and I desperately wanted a phaser, and I wanted a tripod when it broke. And so I went, how do I get back to this?
Yeah.
And so, fun story, fast forward, you know, many decades, and I'm on the set on the Titan. There was a rack of phasers.
You son of a bitch.
They didn't give it back. Oh.
Drea, you're new to this game, a little, for the most part. But you have recently truly fallen in love with this franchise.
I have. Well, growing up, my father introduced me to science fiction and fantasy and adventure stories. And so I was watching Aliens and Indiana Jones and Star Wars probably at a very young age, you know, before I could really understand the concepts. But I think that connection to those stories helped me to develop just this awe and real love and adoration for this kind of media. Just otherworldly, the illumination of all these possibilities and all this potential. When I was a teenager and in my 20s, I did start watching Next Gen and realized, like, oh, where has this been all my life? This is amazing stuff. And then recently, our podcast started covering Star Trek, the first 6 movies. So starting with the motion picture, and I actually really loved the first movie.
Yeah.
It was fantastic, and I know that that's
Let's be clear, we watched the director's cut. It's so much better.
There's kind of a mixed reaction to it, but let me say this too more broadly, that if it weren't for storytellers, if it weren't for writers and creators and the folks depicting these stories, actors, I wouldn't really have a career. These are the stories that led me to examine human behavior. It was, you know, comic books and fantasy and sci-fi, all the things I grew up with that propelled me into a field of psychology. I got my PhD. I really wanted to not just study storytelling, but also leave academia. I abandoned the science to take this work into other spaces where more and more people, the public, could enjoy psychological science through the things, the stories, the experiences, the connections you just talked about, not through kind of the gatekeeping of the ivory tower. That's sort of been my goal. And I really loved, I think it was an earlier season of Picard, where Picard quotes Spock as saying that exhilaration enhances the absorption of knowledge. And I found that really inspiring. That's the work that I do. I want folks to feel exhilarated and excited, and that's how I kind of like infuse the science. That's how I teach people about mental health and well-being and resilience. And I hope to continue to do that with these fantastic stories that y'all are telling.
I want to ask about a word that has suddenly started to sort of inject itself into the mainstream a little bit recently. I have to feel like you and I have had something to do with that because we've been talking about it for a while. Parasocial relationships. I want to ask you, Drea, to explain for those who don't know what a parasocial relationship is quickly, but then for our writers, I want to ask, how important it is for you to get psychology correct when writing for characters, whether that's mental health, whether it's mental illness, whether it's just simple emotions and motivations. Drea, take it away first.
So a parasocial relationship is essentially the deep emotional feelings that we have for fictional characters and stories. We're not delusional. We know Picard as a character is not a real character, but if you've been following the storytelling of Picard, you feel quite connected to him. And I think all of us might have a version of a connection or relationship. A lot of people feel this way about Katniss. A lot of feel this way about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because that's been around so long. So what's interesting, and actually there's a lot of scientific research about this, is that when we connect to these characters, there's in our brains, like our actual processing of these emotions, really little difference to real life people. And the reason as a psychologist I'm fascinated with these so-called mediated relationships is that we learn some really important emotional skills when we're enjoying these kinds of series, cinema, storytelling, television, comic books, whatever it might be. There was a lot of work that went into understanding what happened to us during the pandemic. And there was, of course, as we all know, like a huge response to streaming, a huge response to media and different ways in which we actually spent more time in front of our screens. Some of us going toward like really dark dystopian stories, and some of us going to like, nostalgic stories, feel-good, comforting stories. And the research around that shows that not only did a lot of us increase that consumption, but that we also had a reason for that. We were kind of looking toward more certainty. We were looking for a beginning, middle, and end. We were sort of looking for these resolutions that helped us get more comfortable during a crisis. And actually that work continues to pursue this meaning between us and these stories.
Gentlemen?
So I think to the second part of your question, I think to my knowledge, nobody in this room has captained a starship, has traveled to a distant planet, has experienced,
I have 4 pips, sir.
We have not collectively experienced the supernatural, science fiction, paranormal, whatever the elements of the genre that we consume. We haven't experienced those things. But what we all have sort of universally experienced is fear and love and loss and uncertainty and hope and joy and all of those things that make us fundamentally human. So I think to that aspect of your question, the way that you get the psychology right is just writing and being honest about your own experiences, and then translating those through the prism of aliens, ghosts, and spaceships, and haunted houses, and whatever the genre is that you happen to be exploring. And the real benefit of that, and I think it's more important than ever right now to talk not just about writing, but writers, is to have the support of a room, because you might bring your fundamental perspective on a given emotion or feeling or experience, but there's going to be 8, 9 other people in the room who also have all these other different angles of looking at it and ways to interpret it. And then all of that sort of comes through the writing process, hopefully, to create something that, while not necessarily specific, we have not all gone out into the stars, but we all have, all like Riker in season 3, experienced that sense of hopelessness, that questioning of what is out there, that sense of emptiness in ourselves. And if you can tap into that, the rest follows. So, yeah. I'm on. Say more words. Just talk more.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think something that we, correct me if I'm wrong, but something we talked about a lot in the room when we started there was, what is he feeling? What is she feeling? When the scene starts, in the middle of the scene, turn of the scene, and really digging into, for instance, the pivotal scene where it's Picard and Garrard, it's in attack, and it's fraught with tension, it's secrets and lies, and it's complex. But, you know, you talk about that scene and you're like, where are we presenting this? And you start digging in, and I think we started digging in layers of like, well, there's hurt there, there's anger there. And then eventually you get to this begrudging understanding. And who among us hasn't had something that you know, you've approached and not really understood someone's point of view, and gradually come around and get to the truth that I think.
Yeah, and I think it's also about, we iterate the conversation amongst ourselves.
Yes.
You know, so, you know, that scene is interesting in the sense that you did have, the table was split on how they felt about the decisions the characters had made. Half the table was like, I totally get it. The other half is like, oh, I side with him. No, I side with her. And so we actually have the argument amongst ourselves that we then go and we figure out a way to sort of artistically, creatively transcribe and transpose onto our character. And so if you're having that dialogue honestly in the room, hopefully it is presented honestly on screen. And you have to start with that emotion. You're not starting with emotion, you don't have anything.
And in Chris's episode, I think it's yours, was Voyager.
Yeah.
And it was, what is Seven feeling when she's looking at the ship? What the hell does that feel like?
Right.
And we didn't think, okay, what are the words she's going to say, or what's the plot point here? It was like, what is she feeling? And I would argue that all of us go, not just for, hopefully not just for explosions and pew-pew, but we're going to feel something at the end of the day. And that's the stuff that we remember, right? When we're thinking of a great cinematic and television loves of our lives, we remember how it felt. Maybe not necessarily what it was about.
And by the way, you bring up an excellent point there. When we're talking about parasocial relationships, we're not necessarily just talking about people. We're not necessarily talking about characters. I can't imagine having felt any better about what I was watching. Yes, I see Picard on screen, I see Riker, I see all the team that I know and I love, but it's the moment I saw the Enterprise D. And specifically the bridge of the Enterprise D, that everything just sank and came together. It was just a warm hug for me.
Yeah.
When Frakes, Harry kind of held back. He wouldn't let anyone see it being built. And it was being built right next door to the Titan Bridge. And he took Frakes in, Frakes walked in, and he stops and spins. And he goes, I'm getting emotional here. And it was just literally the wooden bones of the ship, but it meant, you could tell, like he had tears in his eyes, that the ship was a character. You know, it's why in Star Trek 3, he goes, my God, it's what like nothing. And you just,
But you had to do.
Because that's the main character too.
I mean, if you, by the way, wanted a psychological study on who each of the actors are as people, watch their faces. If you were there to have watched their faces as they stepped on that set, each of them responded to it in a different way. You know, some with, very stoic, holding it back. Others let it all out. Patrick walked onto the set, blew by everything. It was like, I have questions about my lines, and so everybody approaches it differently. But and I think in the context of season 3, what you're talking about is really interesting because the word nostalgia gets brought up a lot. But the thing is, like, nostalgia is just a word for, memory has an adhesive quality, has a stickiness. It tends to adhere to senses and times. And so when you react to the Enterprise D coming out, it's not just like the dopamine hit of a familiar thing. It's what does that thing evoke in me that was representative of what I was feeling when I first watched it, what was going on in my life. All those things come rushing back. And so using memory and the past as a way to underscore all the emotional things that you're trying to talk about, I think is what elevates it from just being nostalgic for the sake of nostalgia.
Brilliant.
That's such a good point because I wondered, what you just said is so important. How to have knowledge of that and know that there's this underlying emotional connection that a lot of us have to these stories and especially to these characters that they feel very close to, but not to cheapen or saturate that with too much of that nostalgic signs and signals. How did you balance that? How did you feel that was sort of the right amount?
I think a lot of it is you have to and it's to Matt's point, you have to start with the emotion of the moment, you know. So we could easily have started that season or any other, you know, show that invokes these kind of thoughts. We could have started that season with all of them around the table and 10 forward, all there, the first scene, and jammed them all in and said, there you go, we're giving you what you want, guys. But, you know, really what you have to do is what's the emotional journey? What is the correct place for those things to come into the story? And then what is the sort of correct amount of time for them to remain there before, you know, moving on? And so you can't just lean on them for the sake of getting a visceral reaction. It all has to underscore where is Picard in his journey? Who would he start out with? You know, where does he need to get to? And so, you know, when you get Geordi later in the season, when you get Deanna, she comes in, you know, I think at the right time for her character. So we're not just trying to service you. That's easy. You know, we can just overload you with member berries in the first episode if we wanted to. But it's how do we bring them in a way that's not only narratively right, but emotionally right. So that you don't feel like you're being manipulated, you feel like you're being honored, and that these things are coming in with deep connection points.
You mentioned the scene between Picard and Crusher, and just how important that scene is, and it says so much about those two characters, but it also says so much about the show itself. There's so many parallel paths going on with these characters. Andrea, you even mentioned it during that scene that this was one of the more realistic moments for you in the show. This character who is aging, not unlike Kirk in Star Trek II, and starting to realize, although I'm not going to admit that, you know, he was only 50 when that movie happened, and I'm getting real close. But you talked about just how brilliant a performance this was in the writing. Talk a little bit about Picard and aging and coming toward the end of your career and your life and finding out that what could have been something amazing, you feel like you've been robbed of for 20 some odd years.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I thought was done really well here was how consistent his personality needs to be. He can't be too different. And it's very true for us. No matter what happens to us, we tend to have a very long-standing kind of consistency in our personality traits, our characteristics, the way that we express emotions and interrelate. And the times that we actually do transform emotionally and psychologically is when we discover something that has such a big impact and actually has an effect that makes us think about what could have been or what should have been in maybe the decades that we missed out on those things. There's a word for that we use. It's called counterfactual thinking, which is like, oh, if this thing didn't happen, or if it happened in a way that I wanted it to happen, I'm now looking back on that differently and almost creating that history for myself and lamenting on it. And sometimes if it's such a big trauma or such a big discovery or reveal, we can get stuck in the counterfactual thinking, like we get really fixated on like, well, gosh, it should have been different. So I'm curious because very, very serious, impactful things happen to Picard, and his reactions are pretty consistent, but we need to see some drama there. How does that happen? How do you balance that?
Oh man, I mean, honestly, it's talking amongst ourselves as a group, and then bringing Terry in and going, hey, so this is what we're thinking, you know, and even to sort of like the nostalgia of it and finding the balance. It is reliant on a singular vision. It was Terry's vision going, I think we're pushing it too far, guys. Or I think we're pushing, you know, for example, it would have been very easy, I think, to have had Riker and Picard fighting for too short or fighting for too long. Mm-hmm. Both would have been unsatisfying. You know, at a certain point, you're like, my God, guys, just throw blows and kind of come to an understanding. And that really does come down to the showrunner who goes, okay, I think this is the moment when we pivot, right here, and this is when we turn. Or I think we're getting too cute And the conceit that we started out in, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, that like that first week when we were in that weird room on the first floor,
Yeah.
that Terry said, look, I want to do the dream season, and it's going to feel like we got away with something. He was right, and it still feels that way. But something you have to remember is you need to always approach these characters through the lens of the time of the past. They're still them. They're still them. Fundamentally, there are things that just don't change. And yet, what's happened in the past 2 decades that has maybe skewed them a little left, a little right. You know, and you see that, and you see that in the majority, and he's really mad. And you're like, ooh, it's not the majority, I remember. But that was really Terry's kind of mission statement for us from the get-go.
I remember there was a version for like a 30 seconds of the script where someone was like, Geordi walks onto the bridge and just punches Picard, and then someone was like, they're not that different, you know. And I think that's, you know, it's everybody, you know, people don't change like 180 degrees. They change a little.
Yeah.
And it's that friction of the edges rubbing together in the way that they used to interlock perfectly, where you can get really good drama from the season and really explore all those fundamental things. And the other just interesting thing that you bring up about Picard, and I certainly struggled with this early on. I think everybody did to some degree, because we sort of came in for seasons 2 and 3, and it sort of really got let loose in 3. But everybody remembers Picard differently, which was really interesting. Picard, especially that particular character, everybody remembers him as this eloquent, verbose, like the guy who would quote Shakespeare and give a monologue. Everybody who sits down and hasn't written the show before, puts their fingers on a keyboard, wants to write a 3-page monologue for Patrick Stewart. And then you start to realize actually how he's not the character the way you remember him. And then you start to really study and how does he speak and what are those characteristics, and why do I remember him one way from filtered through my own experience, and then when I come to the character 30 years later, suddenly I'm experiencing him differently in another way. So that was all very
great analogy when I first started. You're like, you told me that first week, you're like, hey, be careful. Because he had been on it, like, how long? Before me, like 10 months.
10 years?
10 years. 10 years. And he sat me down and he goes, okay, so the temptation is to write him, like you remember his voice in the 90s.
Yeah.
And he goes, but everyone takes it too far, and it becomes like what is the bad Hemingway competition, what you said, and you're like, and then it becomes parody. So throw that out. And I still did it.
I was the worst defender of it. I took it too far most of the time. Sorry.
Yeah, you would agree.
I'm just disappointed that at no point in time did he ever yell, "Shut up, Wesley." I mean, that's how I remember my Picard. I want to ask about, well, one thing that you brought up is incredibly important, because a lot of times, especially when Next Gen was still being written, and certainly back at the 66, you're really focusing on a couple of people. It's an ensemble show, but it's not always really an ensemble show. And you figured out a way to make this an ensemble show. You gave each character a backstory from these decades, giving them victories, giving them tragedies. I think, Riker and Troy, having lost a son, and the emotional moment where it was revealed that he felt dead inside himself, and knowing that Imzadi can feel that, or can't, is really problematic. Talk a little bit about that relationship and coming to that beautiful moment, especially as it's not just a throwaway, it comes back to help them later in landing that.
I think to some degree, a lot of us on set have either been married or are married, or have had these complex relationships in our lives where you've gone through a tough time with someone that you love, with someone that you care about, and you try to process it together at your own individual speeds, which aren't always the same speed, and sometimes what was two sort of parallel lines now become perpendicular. They hit each other, they ricochet off of each other. And there's a desire to want to reach out to your partner and take their pain and heal their pain, and do things to, when they start to cry, no, don't cry, it's okay, let's move past it, as if that's a solution. But really what they just need to do is be left to their feelings for a minute. All these examples that you come across in your relationships, your marriages. And so we really just drew on a lot of our personal experiences from that, and how do you sort of create a realistic couple who has an unspeakable amount of love for each other, but has come up to something where how they deal with this one particular thing are so at odds, at angles to each other, that they can only navigate it not through special powers, not through silence, but through genuine communication and healing and time to themselves to let the universe give them an experience that changes their point of view in a way that their partner just might not have been able to do at that time. So we've all had that, so we all just talked about it in the room and tried to figure out how to interpret that. I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it was born out of a practical question too, wasn't it? It was like we knew that we were going to start with Riker in episode 1, but we also knew that look, we weren't going to get Marina until much later because she was shooting in London, I think. Yeah. So then it became, okay, well, why is she coming in so late, right? Why? And you start digging in, and you start banging your heads against the wall, and the conversation flowed to, well, what if? I think it was like, what if they're truly not over this pivotal moment? It was you who said in the room. What if they're truly not over this pivotal moment in their lives, and that what we saw in the Pente was kind of a cover? And then that broke open the whole conversation, and then everything started flowing from there. And then it was like, okay, how do we execute that? How do we show that? How much do we show in the beginning from Riker, and then where do we reveal what's really going on down the stretch? Because he's not immediately going to tell Picard how he's feeling. That's almost a shame, almost an embarrassment for him.
And some of it, a little bit, is just how to take two things that aren't necessarily conceived together and make them a piece. So we knew, for example, that we had done this sort of like 4-episode Crimson Tide arc, right? That you're the sinking sub, you're going down into the dark of the depths together. And that was going to be fairly bleak. And so we knew at the end of that little piece of storytelling, we really needed quintessential Star Trek moments of like hope and resilience, and our spirits are fulfilled and reserved and buoyed back up. And it really became, well, wouldn't that be the thing that Riker, if this is the challenge that we've set him on, wouldn't that really be the thing that fills him up and allows him to reach back out to his wife and give him a sort of vocabulary to do that with? And so we were able to sort of dovetail these two sort of separate thoughts into something that respected the emotion that we were trying to tackle.
And Cindy, I think, was the one who came up with the elevator.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
How many seconds it was. And she was like, what if we bookend it that way?
That
and then it circles all the way back. Somebody else said it circles all the way back around to Riker. Yeah. And we're like, there it is. There's the episode.
Speaking of Troy, Dre, you specifically loved the scene with her reading Jack, just even as a therapist, as a humanist. Talk about that moment and what that meant for you, and also, would it be good therapy? Like, is having him relive those moments, best for everyone involved?
It seems to me that a common thread through the whole series was this concept of an honesty about our pain and a willingness to get close to those parts of ourselves that we're afraid of, we worry about, or that could be upsetting to us in some way, could represent something that would devastate us. And every character, I think, we just talked about Riker, every character had those moments of courage around getting closer to really difficult emotions. And the reason I liked this little session, it's this therapy session, if you will, between Counselor Troy and Jack Crusher, is that she was creating this space of trust and honesty with him, knowing there's something stirring in you that you are muting, that you're avoiding, that you're keeping locked away with the representation of the red door. And certainly there's bigger stakes here, but one really important piece of this is you need to come to terms with whatever this fear is. And the only way to do that is for us to sit down and for me to gently walk with you into that door, and for me to be here alongside you no matter what's there. So the therapeutic element is, the way this happens is you approach your fears with somebody, usually a professional, who is providing that space of trust. But also this sense of empathy. No matter what's there, I will still care about you. I will still be beside you. I will, cheerlead you. It will not change the way I feel for you. And there's something there that is a little bit like a counselor. We try to have that unconditional regard, but also a little bit like an auntie too. A family member who's saying like, you're in our family. I want to heal you. I want to comfort you, and I want you to know that whatever comes from this, I'm beside you. I'm with you. I don't think anyone expected what was behind that door, and I've never seen Counselor Troy so distressed, and I don't think I've ever seen her, kind of react in such a big way. But I think we can imagine that the symbolism here is that she, also has now this fear and distress around what's behind that door, regardless of how they're going to resolve that. And I thought that was a nice, realistic way to kind of describe that. And yes, to answer your question, it is good therapy. If we have any parts of ourselves that we are denying, that we're avoiding, that we're locking up, actually all that does is make it stronger. Yeah. We really need to, again, gently, gradually move toward those thoughts, feelings, and behaviors so that we can learn to kind of coexist with them.
Well, Troy, I think, has a line, I can't quite remember the episode, where she said, you can't skip to the end of healing.
Yeah.
And it's not about, for a lot of our characters, most of our characters, it's not about convincing, it's about conversing. You can lay out logically all the reasons why someone shouldn't feel affected by something, but that's not a cure to that. That's not a panacea. And so all you can do is talk through something with them together. And we found ourselves, this is interesting, we had done the series called 12 Monkeys before we had done Picard. And if you've seen Picard season 3 and you've seen 12 Monkeys, you may notice a similarity in the finales, in that we totally stole from ourselves. In the sense that Picard doesn't try to convince Jack to come out of the Borg cube. What he ultimately says that wins the day is, I will stay here with you, and we'll do it together. And in 12 Monkeys, Cole finds himself in a similar situation of wanting Cassie to do something, to not do something that she's considering doing, and he doesn't attempt to convince her so much as he says, okay, do it, and we'll go through it together if that is what you want. And that is Star Trek, right? That is, it's not just about making a unilateral decision, it is about we will go through this adventure as a team, we will provide our unique insights, our unique points of view, and together, because of all of our gifts and all of our communication, we will have the best outcome. So we always try to defer to that level of emotional conversation, not just like, let me tell you the plot reasons why you should not want this to happen now.
You're not the only one to come over from 12 Monkeys to Star Trek. Just because he's not in the room doesn't mean we can't talk about him. I'll talk about maybe one of the most divisive characters in Star Trek. How many people from moment one loved Liam Shaw? Honestly, maybe a little more than I thought. I loved Liam Shaw. How many by the end loved Liam Shaw? Obviously, he's been through some stuff. He's got reasons for feeling the way he does, but then also by the end, we find out that it's not necessarily all, while it might be true, he doesn't necessarily, he acknowledges in his proposal to Starfleet that her name is Seven of Nine. You know, he won't tell her, but he acknowledges that he is doing something there. Talk a little bit about this character specifically, and how you decided to bring him into the universe, believing that this could be a character that people absolutely hate, knowing that also a parallel to 12 Monkeys a little bit.
Okay. No, we knew we needed a foil, right? We knew we couldn't just have because of the circumstances under which Picard and Riker were going on board the Titan, we knew the Titan had to have a captain. We knew you can't just erase that person from the story simply because wouldn't you love to just have Picard back in a captain's chair? So we had to make this a real flesh and blood, fully realized character. And the best drama you can get is
Todd Stashwick.
Is Todd Stashwick. Like, and to have the person who you would most say yes to in any situation, Captain Picard, absolutely, do whatever you want, take my ship, and then you'd be like, no. And then just have a character who's going to say no to the one guy that you would be mortified to say no to. But then to really, over the course of 10 episodes, give him a real human reason why he would do that. I mean, we had collectively a blast writing that dinner scene where you first meet him because he's such an asshole. But like, it was delicious and delightful to write, and you knew how, because we'd worked with Todd so well at 12 Monkeys, you knew how he'd deliver it, and you can write for him, because you just know that he's going to take what you do and make it 10 times better. But we also didn't write that scene in a vacuum. We knew where he was going. We had talked about, sort of the arc that he was going to experience, when he was going to sort of tell his truth, what that was going to inspire him to change in himself. And how it would dovetail with Seven's story. So we could write that and set up all the little things that we needed to adjust as we went. And then to Todd's credit, he just brought, you want to talk about why actors should be paid way more than they're paid. Todd Stashwick is the living, breathing, a living, breathing example of someone who just takes, a scene that you could write on the page, and you might even walked away from having written the scene going, I'm feeling pretty good about that today. I think I did a good job. And then he'll do it, and you'll be like, oh, I didn't know I did that. He's terrific, and he brings such dimensionality to the character, and then added shades and layers more than I think we had even ever intended in the room. So we were able to, because we were filming and kind of writing at the same time, see what he was doing and really play to that strength and turn the volume up, maybe more than we would have on the page, just because he's so terrific.
He's the cheat code.
Yeah.
He really is. Like, you can write a son of a bitch on the page, and you can have actor A, B, C, D, and E read it, and you're like, God, keep that guy. I'm not going to watch this anymore. But you can watch Todd as Deacon, and you're like, oh my God, gold. And I can write as mean as I want, and you'll still be with it because he's so damn likable. And he is an elected, and he's the nicest, sweetest guy. And so you can push, I think, it's what we learned from the Monkeys crew. They kept telling us, like, push the boundary. We'll tell you when you've gone too far. And when it comes out of his mouth, honestly, it'll be fine. In fact, it'll be better than fine, it's going to be funny. If you're right. Perfect.
I have like 20 more questions. This is definitely going to be a multi-part panel, I'm sure. Come back next year. But I want to give you the opportunity to ask some questions as well. Keep in mind that, again, we're not going to talk about the strikes, and we're not going to talk about potential future Star Trek, because no one on this panel can answer that. But the first hand I saw go up was this young lady here.
Probably original series of Star Trek, they seem to have like a formula where there was one character that was really emotional, and McCoy was really emotional, and Spock was really not. And then that's kind of evolved through all of them. And in season 3 of Picard, we see those decisions being made. Like, Seven was emotional because she wanted to go with Picard, let him do what he wanted. Shaw was by the book, not. Is this an intentional formula that we're using that we see or remind us of seeing patterns that aren't there?
I think it's just about we always approach, and I hope this answers your question. We always just approach, and this is just to our taste, different writers, and it really is the lovely thing about Star Trek in general. Just as a side point, Star Trek is such an umbrella under which so many different kinds of stories could be told in so many different ways. And you're seeing now people who were inspired by TOS, TNG, and then became lovers of science fiction, but then hit Battlestar, or then hit, whatever sci-fi show along the way, and then that got in their DNA, and then those people are now doing a different kind of Star Trek. So you can have like Lower Decks and Strange New Worlds and us on at the same time. So I can only speak for our creative process, which is that, we just try to give every character in every scene an emotional reason to be there. What do they want? What are they trying to achieve? What are they trying to work through? And not just give it all to sort of one hero character and let everybody serve up through them. Like, yes, the show is called Picard, but it's not about a group of people making one guy look great. It's about a group of people working through their own unique, interesting, equally weighted feelings and challenges together in the context of space explosions.
What's brilliant about that too is that it culminates in everybody participating in that sense of compassion, empathy, contributing to individuality. Everybody has that kind of sense of collective participation in this, which I think involves emotion for everyone in their own way, in their own development of what that means at that time. So it's really, it kind of just clicks, like a Rubik's Cube.
I think it's really kind of what you're saying, which is everyone needs a moment, because everyone has a favorite, right? Everyone's got their favorites. Everyone needed a moment, not just in season, but in the finale. Go back and watch this finale, you can spotlight every single one of them all the way through. And the editors, Benny's here, there he is. He's one of my editors. They're very keenly aware that when you listen to the score, everyone knew you got to give everyone's favorite their moment. But I think deeper than that too, I think some of it's just a product of time. Back then, I think TV was, people thought, I think, that these characters were constructs. Spock only could do this. Kirk could only do that. Everyone had their assigned roles, and especially then, TV executives were like, well, this person can't do that. That's not their role. Whereas now, because of the advent of sophisticated dramas and peak TV, I think the challenge was like, okay, we have an opportunity here to enrich every single one of them, fill them out. And we stand on the shoulders of giants who came before us. So how do we honor that? By taking what was and making it for today's audience and modernizing it. And yet still keeping true to what came before.
Saw your hand go up, sir.
Yeah, so something that really impressed on me with Picard Season 3 was the sheer claustrophobia of the season, of all of the characters being mainly on the Titan and then the Enterprise towards the end. That was from the previous two seasons, so why do you think that was so important for the story to put that pressure on the characters that way?
Well, there's two answers to that question. One answer is production logistics. Right? We come out of COVID. It was a difficult time, and so there was a sense of how do you work with what you do? And we'd had these beautiful sets, and I think to Terry's credit, and this is one thing I will one of the lessons I think we took away from 12 Monkeys as well, which, I mean, if you've seen it, it's a complex, it's a time travel show. We're going to different period of time every week, and we made that for a relatively small amount of money. And so you had to be really clever about how you used the sets you had, the resources you had, but what springs out of that is how do you, if you don't have 12 rooms and planets that you can go to, then it needs to be emotionally grace. It has to be, great drama, great emotion, great friction between your characters. And so that Crimson Tide, claustrophobic, we're all sort of stuck in a place that's sinking and the lights are dimming and it's challenging us in different ways and thrusting us at odds with each other. That just makes for great TV. So it was us trying to make the most dramatic effect out of practical limitations. And I will say though that if we had had all the money in the world, I'm not entirely sure the season would have been all that different. Because I think the aim was to do what we did with those characters, and I think we just had the blessing of kind of practicality and creativity, great writer's room, great production design that allowed us to enhance the emotion and the psychology and the relationships.
I also love ship battles.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
yes.
We just miss ship-to-ship combat. We miss, and then shot of dragon.
Yeah.
That was very big, and I'm like,
Yeah.
Well, and the Shaw maneuver coming in and breaking the. I mean, it has the DNA of Star Trek II, certainly.
I drew that on the whiteboard. Remember that? I mean, like how it's and it's just having fun. It was like playing with toys. Of going like, what if the ship just breaks the tracker beam? And then he goes, and the two of them go. That's it. Right, we're done.
I want to get a few more questions in. We got 5 minutes. Anybody? Okay, so we'll go with this gentleman here.
What is something that you think was like you were super proud of doing in Picard season 3?
Oh God. Look, there's a lot of lines and moments and scenes that I could point to and go, I'm happy and proud to have had my fingerprints on that. But I think more than anything, I think what I have to say is I'm proud to have worked with these writers. Because no episode was one person's voice. I mean, the thing that Terry does well, the thing that the room did really well itself, was to harmonize and to really be a choir of creative voices. And a lot of that, sometimes it came after a little creative tussling and there was friction amongst ourselves or whatever, but everybody on our staff had a strength and something they did really well. And I think we all played our instruments really well together, and every script, no matter who was credited on there, somewhere in there is the DNA, is the voice, is the contribution of almost every writer on the staff. And I'm most proud of that.
No, it's true. I mean, like Terry he's a brilliant conductor, and he knew start to finish what the song sounded like. And we all knew when we hit it, and we all knew when we got off it, and we trusted our conductor to lead all of us and to play our instruments, harmonize as best as we could. That's the deep end. The shallow answer is we got soft, and that my wife was cast. So that forever is still my marriage. So I'm very happy with that.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you repeat the question?
So the question is about Rafi and her arc and responsibility this season, that drive to continue going when she's being told by everyone to stop, sometimes even Worf, but also the relationship with Worf as the mentor.
Yeah, I think a lot of that came from, Rafi had a lot of great shared experiences in season 2. Her story with Seven, and that relationship, and I think one of the things we really wanted to do in this season was to explore each of those stories, each of those characters rather, kind of give them their own internal stories, so that they weren't sort of part of a duet. And even though Rafi does really perform well with Worf, we learn a lot more. For those first couple of episodes, she's out there on her own. She struggled with all of these things, being pulled back into her past, like having to prioritize this mission over self and family. And so that was really the arc that was begun in the first 2 seasons that we really felt we had to complete in season 3. And sort of Worf, as the sort of template warrior monk, was able to give her this interesting perspective and guide her through it, but also learn from her. So she, in some ways, becomes the teacher to him in that relationship. And so that by the end of this season, what we really wanted was, if we're closing the book on the sort of Picard as a story, whether or not there are future stories to tell, everybody kind of got their ending. Everybody kind of got a place to start from in further adventures. And so we really felt like we had to honor sort of what was begun with Rafi in season 1 and 2, but let her complete her own journey. And so that was really important to us, to give her a path to do that. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Just wondering, how do you balance, as you explore all these traumas so beautifully, and like with Rafi's drug addiction, how do you balance doing all that amazing work with like kind of the utopian ideals that Mr. Roddenberry had? So as storytellers, how do you kind of guide those waters to make sure you're sticking to Roddenberry's sandbox and doing what you guys do?
So very quickly, because I know this could be a big question, but guiding the waters between Roddenberry's vision and that interpersonal conflict that he even said shouldn't happen between members of the crew.
I think it is always, you always have to default to teamwork. You always have to default to family. You have to default to these people who have this complex history with each other, however at loggerheads they may be, coming together to solve their problem in a way that could only be solved by all of them contributing. And that is a very positive, forward-looking, utopian, that is the heart of Star Trek. Now, fortunately, because we were on a ship and because of the story we were telling, we didn't really have to explore what that looks like out in the world too much. We were on sort of one planet, we're on these ships telling an admittedly dark story, but if you're telling that with light, positive, loving characters who even through their pain and grief arrive at the poker table at the end, who can all smile and share a drink, then I think you are serving that vision. I hope that's the answer to your question.
Amazing. We are being given the 0 minutes left, so that means we've got to go very quickly. Would you please let us know where we can find you? Online, at the convention, where?
I'm on Twitter at CW Monfette. You can also find me at that handle on Instagram. And one thing we can say as writers, as a staff, look, this show would not have been successful without your love, your support, your engagement. We have all been so heartened by the interactions we've had with fans on Twitter. We listen, we hear you, we try to engage. So please, hit us up, talk to us. We want to continue the conversation and hopefully into future projects beyond. So,
Matt?
Just like Garrard Whatley on Twitter and Instagram, find me there. And thank you all so much. That was 10 thrilling weeks for us. To all those of you who stayed up to watch the midnight drops, all of you who engaged on social media, it meant the world to us. And 12-year-old me is the song.
Drea?
I want to first use my time to let people know, if you are not on strike and you want to support, please go to the Entertainment Community Fund. Entertainmentcommunity.org, I think is the website. You can find my work on drdreapsychology.com or on Instagram, Dr. Drea Psychology. And the Arkham Sessions is our podcast all about the psychology of pop culture. Please check it out. Round of applause for our moderator, Brian Ward.
Thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your show.
Thank you so much.